So there are two ways to measure inflation. There's what is called the GDP deflator, and there is the consumer price index. So we're going to look at each one of those. So let's start with the GDP deflator. The GDP deflator is a measure of inflation based on what is happening with nominal GDP. So when we look at the GDP deflator, we have nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100. So if we're looking at this for our pizza and calzone example, then the nominal GDP that we found was 420. The real GDP was 350. If we take 420 and divide by 350 and multiply times 100, we can calculate the GDP deflator. So 420 divided by 350 times 100 is 120. A GDP deflator of 120 tells you how much inflation there's been since the base year. And that's because we need to look at what we know about the base year. So when you calculate nominal GDP is the value of your goods and services in the current year. And real GDP is the value of your goods and services in the base year. In the base year, nominal GDP and real GDP are going to be the same number. So in your base year, your GDP deflator is going to be equal to what? Oh, the nominal GDP and the real GDP are going to be the same number. Anytime you take the same number and divide it by itself, you get 1. 1 times 100 is 100. So the GDP deflator in the base year is 100. So if we calculate the GDP deflator for our 2018 pizza and calzone example as 120, it tells us that there has been 20% inflation since the base year. Okay, so you need nominal GDP and real GDP to calculate the GDP deflator, or as we'll look at in a later video, if you have the GDP deflator, you can calculate either nominal or real GDP using the same formula. So the GDP deflator measures inflation by looking at all the goods and services produced in the economy and what's happening with their prices. The other way to measure inflation is to use a price index. So a price index is a bundle of goods and services, and the one that we look at for a price index is called CPI, the Consumer Price Index. It's a measure of what the typical Canadian family consumes. And in fact, let's take a look at some of the weightings that they put on those goods and services. So let's just go into Stats Canada. So here is the basket weights. They get adjusted every couple years to reflect the percentage of income that households spend on different items. So you can see here, this is across Canada, but you can also change it for different provinces. But let's look at Canada for now. And we can see that in terms of food, the typical household is spending about 16% of their income on food, and about 27% of their income on shelter. And if you've watched any of the Gail Von Oxley show or some of those shows on TV about managing your budget and your household income, they often say 25% is how much you should be spending on a house. You can see that in Canada we're a bit over that at 27%. You can see then that we spend about 20% of our income on transportation. So based on how we divvy up our income, this is used to help create that basket of goods the typical household buys, and then we can look at what happens to the prices of those items. So what's happening to the price of food? What's happening to the price of gas? Alcoholic beverages, healthcare, that all goes into what the typical household buys, and so we can measure inflation based on household spending. Is it costing the household more to live? Right? You've heard of a cost of living adjustment. That idea is that you're getting a pay raise to compensate for inflation, and inflation's being measured by CPI. All right, so let's go back to our notes. So how do we measure inflation using a consumer price index? Well, the way that you calculate CPI, so CPI is the cost of your market basket that the typical Canadian household buys, and we're looking at that cost of that market basket in the current year. And we're going to divide that by the cost of that same basket of goods and services in the base year. And then we're going to multiply the whole thing times 100. So let's assume that in our pizza and calzone example, the average household consumes 2 calzones and 2 pizzas. Okay? So, to calculate consumer price index, we need to figure out the cost of this basket of goods, these 2 calzones and 2 pizzas, in the current year, and the cost of that basket of goods in the base year. So if we refer back, we know that in 2008, the price of a pizza was $10 and the price of a calzone was $5. And in 2018, the price of a pizza was $12 and the price of a calzone was $6. All right, so let's calculate CPI. The typical household buys 2 calzones, and in 2018, the price of the calzone is $6. The typical household buys 2 pizzas, and in 2018, the price of those pizzas is $12. Okay. Now, for the bottom of the formula, we need the cost of that basket of goods in the base year. So we have that same 2 calzones, but this time in the 2008 prices. And we have those 2 pizzas, but this time we have to look at it in the 2008 prices of pizza, which is $10. And after we do that calculation, we'll multiply the whole thing times 100. All right, so 2 times 6 is 12, plus 2 times 12, that's 24. So we get a total for the top of our formula of 36. Then we have 2 times 5, which is 10, and 2 times 10, which is 20. So 20 plus 10 is 30. And we're going to take our 36 over 30 and multiply it times 100. So 36 over 30 times 100 is 120. What does this 120 tell you? Well, we interpret the consumer price index the same way you interpret the GDP deflator. So 120 tells us there's been 20% inflation since the base year. And that's because in the base year, if the base year is the current year, then your current year and your base year prices will be the same, and you're calculating the same number over the same number, which is 1 times 100, and you get a CPI of 100 for the base year. So we compare 100 to the number we calculated for CPI, and that tells us the amount of inflation, 20%. If you get a CPI of 98, Then you've had 2% deflation since the base year, because again, we're still comparing it to 100.